Instead of focusing on winning arguments, we're teaching the basic fundamentals of sales and marketing and how we can use them to win in the world of politics, teaching you how to meet people where they're at on the issues they care about. Welcome to The Brian Nichols Show. Well, happy Tuesday there, folks. Brian Nichols here on The Brian Nichols Show, and thank you for joining us on, of course, another fun-filled episode. Today, I am joined by Liberty activist. He is also the host of the Liberty Hour podcast, Angelo Veltri. Welcome to The Brian Nichols Show, my friend.
How are you doing, man?
Doing good and busy as ever. I just, you're my first, okay, Angelo, here. This is an actual real honor, I would say, for you. You were my first guest as I've officially moved to Indiana. I did a solo episode yesterday, but you're the first guest in person. Well, I say in person, but for the Brian Nichols Show here as I got out to Indiana. So thank you for joining me today. And I know we're kind of in a weird setup here as I'm in the middle of a spare bedroom because is my studio ready? Of course. I moved here in like 3 days ago, but enough about me and my moving chaos. My audience has heard enough about that. Angelo, welcome to the program. There's a lot behind the title there that we were talking about. I have it scrolling here at the bottom of the YouTube. But in the intro, you're the host of the Liberty Hour pod, but you do so much more than that, Angelo. So let's introduce yourself to the Brian Nichols Show audience, and let's kind of go into your story of your path to liberty. And obviously, you're Gen Z. So let's kind of dig into your Gen Z liberty story, because I would say it must be difficult being a Gen Zer and touting the flame of liberty. No?
Yeah, so thank you for having me on. I do appreciate it, and I do feel honored being the first guest for you moving to Indiana, so that is a feather in my cap. But thank you once again, and yeah, so basically I came to Liberty from being a sort of, I guess you could say, staunch conservative, being in the Republican Party and following along with basic Republican talking heads such as Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity, and all the likes of Fox News, and thinking that, but they're telling the truth. They're not, and no real media source is, and that's something that I've came to learn. But basically, my path to liberty started back just before the pandemic. I sort of started catching on to a lot of the duopoly BS, I guess you could say. And I started realizing that the Republican Party didn't really fit me anymore. They weren't standing up for my freedoms. They weren't standing up for my liberty. And they weren't doing anything to protect my rights. So at that point, I started venturing out, looking into the Libertarian Party. And then the pandemic happened. And that's when I turned from like, oh, well, Trump's doing a couple decent things to he's not doing much of anything at all, and he might be screwing things up. And so I've evolved from being sort of a Republican Trumper back in 2016 to being full-blown libertarian anarchist almost in 2020. And then from there, I enrolled in the Libertarian Party, became part of the Suffolk County Libertarian Party in New York, currently working on their social media and stuff like that. Some community outreach as well, and then made it onto the New York State Libertarian State Committee. So now I'm on there, hopefully going to be doing some more work with them as well. And Young Americans for Liberty, I'm also a part of. That's why I am here, not in my usual studio. So I've been knocking doors for school choice down in Virginia. But really, liberty for me has brought me to a bunch of places that I did not expect to ever go. So I'm very thankful that I've found my path here.
Isn't it funny how liberty has brought us all to weird little areas we never thought we'd end up? Like, did I ever think I was going to end up in a state like Indiana? Nope. I was born and raised in New York State, and fun fact: so my family was just a history of dairy farmers, and that's just kind of the way things are up in northern New York. You get your family farm, you get your lineage lined up, and then it's just you pass it down generation after generation, and that's just kind of how things are done. And then all of a sudden, well, granted, fast forward a little bit, and you see in New York, the consequences of these left-wing policies really hurt my home area, where all the jobs left. Any plant that was up there for manufacturing got out of town because New York was so expensive to do business. And then I ended up going to Philadelphia. I was there for 6.5 years. And again, you kind of saw like the leftist policies, but they didn't really hurt too much because things were kind of booming. To be real, things have been going very, very well for the most part. And obviously, is it all real? not really. It's all big, a big bubble. But with that being said, all of a sudden, COVID hits. And all the leftist policies, again, came home to roost. And it made it so obvious of how important it is to put yourself in situations where, yeah, you are surrounded by people who are like-minded and focus on the same goals. That's partly why I took this trip out to Indiana, is because it was that time to make that switch. So let me kind of turn towards you, because you're in New York, right? And you're not today. You're obviously in Virginia.
Not today, but I am from New York. Yeah,
you're helping our good friends out there, Young Americans for Liberty. I know our buddy there, Eric Brakey, must be applauding as he hears your helping knock on doors in Virginia. But when you're talking about New York, I know, and I left back in 2015, 2014. It was on the way down, and now whenever I go home, I'm always greeted by police sitting at the border waiting to see if they can get me for a speeding ticket. I see friends complain about the just insane restrictions. Their kids are just being put with wearing masks nonstop, and it's killing just generations of kids. Their future aspirations, their goals, their hopes, their dreams, they're just going down the toilet. And I mean, you're 21, so you're in the ballpark of the generation who's truly experiencing the impact of COVID. So let's kind of approach this two ways. What's it been like being in New York for the past few years? But number two, what's it been like being Gen Z and having to deal with this COVID pandemic? I'm sure you must have had a very interesting experience, especially with these being some very formative years where you're hanging out with a lot of friends and hopefully making some memories.
Yeah, so basically, so for the first point on the pandemic starting and all that, and living through the pandemic in New York, or at least on Long Island for me, my county is somewhat red. It's very politically neutral in a sense when you really talk to the people, but the mask policies and stuff like that, certain stores like mobile gas stations and like Walmart and all the big stores were pretty much following along, and so were the small stores for a while, like the mom and pop shops, but eventually they started to wean out of it, and they were like, yeah, we're not gonna make anybody, we want to make money, so we're not gonna force people to do anything that they don't want to do in their store. So there was really like a lot of non-enforcement going on, and you could even walk into those big stores with your mask down. But now we've evolved into the whole vaccine mandate thing, where New York City has implemented the vaccine mandate that was under de Blasio last year. And it went really quickly from vaccine while he's eating the burger, and you get a free bag of fries or whatever on the side of it for getting your vaccine, to if you don't get it, now you're not allowed to get burgers or fries. But that's neither here nor there. Being a Gen Z, because New York City doesn't really affect me out in Long Island, but being Gen Z from Long Island and being from the school that I was from, it seems like there's a split between what our generation is really made up of. I guess you could say back 20, 30, 40, even 50 years ago that there were regular conservatives and classical liberals and mainly people who are more toward the center. But as generations have went on, we've become much more polarized and pushed out toward the ends. So at this point, you have literal walking communists in high school, as well as complete anarchists like me. I mean, I wasn't really that much of a libertarian in high school. I was more of a Republican, but throughout time, it seems like the generations, not that they're moving more toward liberty in a sense, but that they're becoming much more polarized toward authoritarianism and libertarianism. So basically there's a lot, but there is an influx of like liberty-minded individuals because of that, but also on the other end too.
Wow. Okay. So let's dig into that, because that's fascinating. I remember back when I was in high school, middle school, heck, I was that nerdy kid back in elementary school who I was interested in Bush v. Gore. I was like, yeah, let's pay attention to this in class. And the kids were like, can we play Beyblades, please? And I'm like, okay. But seriously, like I look at the fact that, and by the way, Beyblades was probably like 3 or 4 years. I'm actually like thinking about
I
that
used
in my
to play
head.
with them. They were fun.
Yeah, and I'm like, there's probably somebody who's like fact checking, like Beyblades weren't around when they were doing Bush v. Gore, and I'm gonna be like, okay, it's probably Pokemon or something. So give me a break. But when you think back to the conversations that were being had, and like the conversations didn't exist. let me reframe the context. Those conversations didn't exist. There we go. Because let's be real, there wasn't really that much of a focus on these issues. And I don't know for what reason. Actually, I know for what reason, because we really never had to really live politics. Politics kind of was the thing that happened, but it didn't impact you super directly all the time. Yeah. And growing up, you didn't really, think about it too much. But I guess you really had to live the politics, right? Like, especially over the past few years, your generation has been most directly impacted by these COVID mandates, by these just insane policies, not only just from the academic standpoint, but then you take the mental health standpoint and to see the rising cases of suicides, of self-harm, of drug use and overdoses. I have lost far too many friends to drunk driving, suicide, overdoses over the past 2-3 years. And I can almost guarantee that 2, if not 3 of them were directly attributed to what just happened in result of the COVID pandemic policies, not the disease itself, the ensuing policies. And that right there, I think it's interesting because it, to your point, it's almost radicalized a generation, but it's radicalized it in 2 different ways. One generation's radicalized to the extent where we have, this, like you, the Republicans who are maybe now turning anarchists. But now you're talking about those walking communists in high school, which I laughed at inside. That was great. But also scary, because I can almost guarantee that they probably came to be during the years, probably at the end of Trump, right? Where you just had this constant drumbeat of he's a fascist dictator, he's taken over. Watch, he's gonna overthrow the U.S. government with his January 6th siege of all the people at the Capitol building who were walking around and looking. Okay. Let's not talk about that anymore. Yeah. Before we get banned on YouTube. But no, seriously, it's interesting because you see there has been an increasing push, and this is not just, I think, unique to your generation, but it's maybe more so focused on in the younger generation where it never really was before. Am I diagnosing this correctly, that because of the fact that your younger generation has really had to live and be a part of these conversations where traditionally we really didn't, that now you're being brought into the fight and it's pushing people to take positions they otherwise really wouldn't have even considered in the past?
Yeah, well, especially with schools specifically, just because think back to New York in, what was that, maybe around 2012, around that time, where there was the whole argument of Common Core in schools.
Yep.
This has sort of evolved over a decade into becoming critical race theory now. Now, granted, I know what critical race theory is. I have a decent understanding of it, but I also don't believe that anybody should be subject to teaching it or having to not learn it, or that people should be able to make their own choices on what they want to learn. But also in school, from the whole concept of moving more drastically in the authoritarian, becoming more radicalized in a sense, that it was a lot to do with Trump. Trump was just a figurehead amongst not even politics anymore. He was just like an average household name that people were either making fun of or adoring or just were completely indifferent to. But regardless, he was always talked about. So at that point, you have high schoolers now always talking about this. And once you get people wearing Trump stuff to school and wearing anti-Trump stuff to school, now you get the conversation going even more, and it's out of the administrator's hands at that point. So what I've seen now is a lot of the people that were back then in high school calling Trump a fascist and he's a dictator and he's an emperor, he's a king, and now Biden is coming through with all of his authoritarian policies, which they like to call Trump a fascist for excluding people who were transgender for the first 5 years out of the military because they need certain medications that the military can't pay for. And there was a whole reasoning behind that. And the military is completely under the jurisdiction of the federal government through our Constitution. Now they've evolved into saying that having vaccine or mask mandates are okay, and that's not fascism, and that's just that's public health and that's safety, when that is literally nearly, if not the textbook definition of fascism, when you have a merger of corporation and state colluding to keep out certain people from their business. So it's sort of morphed from them just calling Trump a fascist and all of this is fascist and fascist this, fascist that, we're anti-fascist. And then the fascism comes and they're nowhere to be seen. So
Angelo,
that's the way I see it.
If you had to guess, right, and this doesn't have to be a scientific number, but you talk about the split in the libertarian anarchists, let's say in the Gen Z, and then as you again coined so well, the walking commies, which is again terrifying. But when you look at that, what would you say the actual percentage breakdown? Is it really, you have almost two mountains if you were to look at it in terms of like a one of those bell curves, like, you peak on the commie side, flattens out across the middle, and peaks at the anarchist side? Or is it kind of what you'd see in America traditionally, where you have little peaks, little valleys, larger peak more in the moderate, and I'd say moderate obviously being more of like the independent minded probably being the younger generation, and then obviously pan out again and start a little bit smaller of a peak as you get more towards the radical on the right? Is that kind of how you see it pan out, or is it truly splitting and you're having more larger mountains, if you will, on either side?
So going back to what you said earlier about how back when you were in school that nobody cared about politics,
right,
it's still sort of that way to a certain extent, where there are just people who are completely apolitical, and they just don't follow politics, they don't care about politics, and they don't want to hear it. If somebody tells them to put on masks, they do it, whatever, and then they just go about their day. But from what I've seen is that maybe back in your day, where 95% of the kids just were completely apolitical, and then you had both sides with like 2.5%. Now it would be more of, I'd say, 60% in the middle, and then maybe like 10% toward the middle right or middle left, and then a little bit more toward the more extreme. So it's sort of merging out a little bit, and it's becoming a little bit more equal all across the board. But that's obviously all anecdotal evidence from what I've seen.
Oh, no, this is all
school.
great stuff. Yeah, this is great stuff because, like, let's be real, right? I'm an old fuddy-duddy, and there are people who listen to this show who are significantly older than I, who are older fuddy-duddies. So it's good to get this context of what you're experiencing right now. And I guess let's look at that 60% in the middle that you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say is the top concerns that they're thinking about right now? Is it anything political, or is it overtly things that are in their own, like the things they can see, touch, smell? Is it that kind of thing where it is more, I don't say self-centered, that's not the expression I want to say, but like, is it kind of that mentality, or
it's
they
the whole what directly impacts my life? What do I need? And for certain people, there are people that are completely apolitical, but they don't have health care. So they're like, or they've been kicked off their parents' plan, whatever the case may be, and they go, well, I want universal health care. And that's the only issue that they care about. And they might vote Democrat. And even if it's only in presidential elections, which are the most voted in, where they might only vote Democrat because they want that one outcome. So they became a single issue voter now. So that's why I'm saying where they moved like a little bit toward one side, but not fully. And the people that were already like in the middle or have moved all the way over now.
See, this right here, and I mean, interrupt. This is why what Spike Cohen always talks about in terms of listening for not what the person says they want, but rather where their problem is. And that's why right there. So you just said they probably say, oh, I want universal health care. What they're saying, and again, we have to do more digging, but one can assume in an intelligent manner, of course, when we're assuming here, that they don't want just necessarily universal health care. They rather are looking for more affordable healthcare access because they are having problem affording healthcare. So instead of presenting a solution that will give them just free healthcare, right? We have to be able to help better present solutions that will help bring down the costs of healthcare to make it more accessible. And I think right there is sometimes where we lose the conversation, because we hear the person say, I want universal health care. And instead of hearing someone who we're having a communication issue, we hear you're my enemy. You want the thing that I hate. And then we put up the barriers. And instead of having that necessary dialogue in order to engage in that conversation, we just instantly turn off. I mean, did you watch the movie Klaus by chance?
I haven't.
No. Okay. No spoiler alerts, I promise. But in the movie, there's two, I don't say they're families, but they're like two sides in a community, and they've been fighting for nonstop. And when they come to think about the reason why, there is no real reason why. It's just because there ended up being two controlling families who wanted to keep the fighting going so they could keep the power. Sounds kind of familiar. But you almost see that's what would happen long term, is that you just have these two sides fighting. It's like, wait, why are we fighting? And I kind of see that with Republicans and Democrats, in more of the moderates than you would more so like the more radicalized, I'd say, people like we were talking about earlier. But like your average person, I think it was in the 80s, I think it was like the old Speaker of the House who said, what's the dime's worth of difference between a Republican or a Democrat, and about a nickel or something like that. Just they're not very different at all. But it's more so because I think they're fighting the wrong battle. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, they both become authoritarian parties. That's the problem. There is no liberty-minded people. That you might have liberty-minded people in those parties, but the parties as a whole and their platforms have become very authoritarian. So when people start to realize that they don't have a route out of this, we can't vote Republican out of this, we can't vote Democrat out of this, that's when you get people starting to look toward third parties. And it's really surprised me, honestly, to see the amount of people, like, granted, it's not hundreds or thousands, but the amount of people that have become more liberty minded by watching my content out of high school, to see them constantly engaging with me and constantly like agreeing with what I'm saying. So there is definitely a liberty revolution going on. And it's happening very fast at this rate. I think there was over 100,000 or maybe it was over 50,000 registered libertarians over the course of 2020. It just woke people up to the fact that Democrats don't and outright don't give a shit about your liberties, and then Republicans placate it, and then they actually still don't at the end of the day. So more people are waking up to that, more people are joining the Libertarian Party, and more people are growing the liberty movement as a whole.
We're getting there, man. Baby steps. And hey, thank you for fighting the good fight in New York. Definitely, I appreciate you staying up there, fighting and taking the slings and arrows. I've taken all that I could take for the past 20 plus 25, 30 years at this point. 30 plus years. And I decided it was time to get out of the Northeast. So hasta luego, Northeast. And now I'm out to the Midwest. And I got to tell you, I've only been here about 4 or 5 days officially, and it's been refreshing, my friend. So if you're ever looking to escape for a hot second, I have a couple places to recommend. But Angelo, unfortunately, let's look at the clock. We are already close to time. So what I want to make sure we do here is, number one, I want to give you a platform here for final thoughts, anything you want the audience to make sure they take away from today's episode, especially when we're talking about the issues that Gen Z is focusing on, how we can better address those concerns, especially those folks in that 60% zone that I think are more open to our conversations. But number two, we want to make sure people are able to go ahead and follow the Liberty Hour podcast. So where can people go ahead and find that? But also they can go ahead and find you and stay up to date with all of the interesting stuff that's happening over your world. And also they want to keep up the conversation. Where can they go ahead and do that?
So you guys can follow me on Instagram and TikTok at Angelo for Liberty. Follow me on Twitter and Getter at Liberty Angelo. I have my website, www.libertyangelo.com. You can follow my track record on the Libertarian Party New York State Committee. I'm also hopefully going to be working with Yal for quite a bit, so you can follow me there. But besides that, the other thing that you, what was your other question to me? Because
in final thoughts for the audience, because obviously you are bringing a lot of interesting things that you bring over the show, but I want to make sure today for focusing on Gen Z as we are leaving the audience, how to reach that 60%, right? Where can we best reach them where we've been failing, or maybe the things that they're thinking about as we leave here, that you could maybe leave the audience with little words of wisdom how to have that conversation?
Okay, so the thing is, I'm a libertarian through and through, but I'm also rational, and I realize that not everybody is a libertarian at heart. So whether you are a Republican or a Democrat now, if you are Gen Z, you need to start looking into third parties, broaden the third party spectrum, join the Green Party, Working Families Party, find a party that actually represents your morals and values. Because granted, we can use the two parties and we can obstruct the bad stuff that they're doing and use them to pass good stuff, but at the same time we need to give people more options, gives people more choices, and start looking into third parties. Because I'm a libertarian. I think the Libertarian Party is the best party out there, but also I know it's not going to be right for everybody. So we are focused as third parties on dismantling the duopoly and taking away their strongholds. So that's really what I want to end off with.
There we go. I have to make sure I have my mic on. There we go. Angelo Veltri, thank you so much for joining us on the program. And folks, of course, if you want to go ahead and make sure that you're not missing out, and we don't want FOMO here, no fear of missing out on the Brian Nichols Show, we'll include all the links to Angelo's social media as well as the Liberty Hour podcast here in the show notes. Just click the artwork in your podcast catcher. It'll bring you right to today's episode. Oh, and I'll make it easier for you folks as well. I'll include the entire transcript as well. So with that being said, Angelo Veltri, the Liberty Hour podcast. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of the Brian Nichols Show.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Brian Nichols Show. Find more episodes at briannicholsshow.com.